For more than 3 decades after his death, the London home of Freddie Mercury existed in a strange state of suspension. Garden Lodge, hidden behind tall, ivy-covered walls in Kensington, was not abandoned, yet it was not alive either. It was sealed, protected, and deliberately kept silent. While the world continued to celebrate Mercury as a flamboyant rock god, the private space where he spent his final years remained untouched, as if time itself had been asked to pause out of respect. When the doors of Garden Lodge were finally opened to the public for the first time, expectations ran wild. Many assumed they would find excess, gold-plated indulgence, proof of a life lived loudly and without restraint. After all, this was the man who commanded stadiums, who turned performance into spectacle, who sang about being unbreakable. But what lay beyond those doors told a far more complicated and unsettling story. The shock did not come from luxury. It came from intimacy. Inside, Garden Lodge felt less like a rock star's mansion and more like a deeply personal archive. Every room carried a sense of careful curation, not for an audience, but for one man trying to make sense of himself. Walls were lined with art that leaned toward the surreal and melancholic, pieces that explored fragility rather than power. These were not decorations chosen to impress guests. They were mirrors of an inner life that few had ever been allowed to see. Then there were the handwritten materials, draft lyrics scribbled on loose paper, notes written in hurried, uneven handwriting, not manifestos, not declarations of genius, but fragments of thought, private reflections, emotional debris left behind by someone constantly balancing confidence and vulnerability. Reading them felt intrusive, as though the house itself was whispering secrets it had been sworn to protect. What unsettled many observers was how ordinary the space felt. Not dull, not bland, but human. Clothes folded with care. Furniture arranged for comfort, not display. Small personal objects placed with intention. This was not the environment of someone intoxicated by fame. It was the refuge of someone exhausted by it. For years, Freddie Mercury had performed strength as an art form. On stage, he was loud, fearless, commanding. But Garden Lodge told a different truth. It suggested that behind the theatrical armor was a man who craved stillness, privacy, and emotional safety. A man who needed a place where he did not have to perform. The moment the public saw inside this house, the myth of Freddie Mercury subtly shifted. He did not shrink. He became larger in a different way. More complex, more tragic, more relatable. The shock was not about what he owned, but about what he felt. The loneliness, the longing, the tenderness that never made it into the spotlight. Garden Lodge was not just a home. It was evidence. Evidence that brilliance often coexists with isolation, and that the loudest voices on stage can belong to the quietest souls behind closed doors. As visitors moved deeper into the rooms of Garden Lodge, the emotional tone shifted. The initial curiosity gave way to something heavier, more introspective. This was no longer about discovering a famous person's belongings. It was about encountering the inner architecture of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of disguise. Here, the masks were gone. One of the most striking revelations was the sheer volume of art. Freddie Mercury was known publicly as a performer, a singer, a frontman. Few understood the depth of his relationship with visual art. The walls were filled with paintings and prints that leaned toward the surreal, the symbolic, and at times the unsettling. Figures appeared distorted, fragile, suspended between beauty and decay. These were not casual purchases. They reflected a mind drawn to complexity, contradiction, and emotional tension. Art historians and longtime fans alike noticed a recurring theme. Many of the works suggested isolation. Bodies stood alone in vast spaces. Faces looked inward rather than outward. It was difficult not to see these images as extensions of Freddie Mercury himself, a man adored by millions, yet profoundly alone in his private world. The art functioned almost like a silent diary, expressing emotions that words could not safely carry. Then came the handwritten pages. These are perhaps the most unsettling artifacts of all. Some were early lyric drafts, familiar lines emerging in raw, unfinished form. Others were fragments without clear purpose. Single sentences, half thoughts, words crossed out and rewritten, as if the writer was arguing with himself. They revealed a restless mind, constantly refining, questioning, and reshaping its own voice. What shocked observers was not the brilliance of these notes, but their vulnerability. They showed doubt. They showed hesitation. They showed moments where confidence faltered. For someone whose public image was built on certainty and command, these private writings painted a very different portrait. They suggested that self-belief was not a constant state, but something that had to be rebuilt again and again, often in solitude. Equally revealing was the absence of chaos. There was a sense of order throughout the house. Objects were placed deliberately. Rooms were balanced, calm, almost meditative. This was not the environment of excess or self-destruction that popular mythology often associates with rock legends. Instead, it felt like the carefully controlled space of someone trying to maintain equilibrium in a life that was otherwise overwhelming. This contrast became one of the central emotional shocks for the public. The world had known Freddie Mercury as explosive, unpredictable, larger than life. Garden Lodge revealed a man who valued control, routine, and aesthetic harmony. It suggested that the theatrical persona was not simply who he was, but who he had to become to survive in the public eye. Perhaps most haunting were the personal notes that were never meant to be read by anyone else. They were not dramatic confessions or tragic declarations. They were quiet, reflective, sometimes mundane. Yet in their simplicity, they carried immense weight. They showed a man thinking about love, loyalty, time, and loss. A man aware of his own fragility, even as the world insisted on seeing him as invincible. For many visitors, this was the moment when admiration turned into something deeper. Sympathy, understanding, a recognition that genius often demands a private cost. The house did not glorify suffering, but made it impossible to ignore. It asked an uncomfortable question without ever speaking it aloud. How much of himself did Freddie Mercury have to give up in order to become a legend? Garden Lodge did not answer that question directly. It did something more powerful. It allowed people to feel the silence he lived with. And in that silence, the image of Freddie Mercury shifted once again, from icon to individual, from untouchable star to deeply human soul. As the exploration of Garden Lodge continued, the narrative surrounding Freddie Mercury deepened in a way few had anticipated. Beyond the art and handwritten words, the house revealed something even more intimate: the quiet, persistent presence of love and the heavy burden of secrecy that shaped much of his private life. This was where the story stopped being about creativity alone and began to confront the emotional cost of living as a global icon in an era that offered little mercy for difference. Throughout the rooms, subtle traces of long-term attachment were everywhere. Not loud declarations or romantic symbolism, but small, enduring signs of connection. Objects kept for decades. Personal gifts carefully preserved. Items that held no financial value, yet were treated with unmistakable reverence. These details suggested stability, loyalty, and emotional continuity, qualities rarely associated with the chaotic image often projected onto Mercury's life. What struck many observers was how deeply domestic the space felt. Garden Lodge was not designed as a temporary retreat. It was a home in the truest sense, a place built around routines, comfort, and familiarity. This directly challenged the long-standing myth of Mercury as a restless, rootless figure, constantly in motion. Instead, it revealed a man who craved permanence, who needed a private world where he could exist without explanation or performance. Yet woven through this sense of love was an equally powerful thread of concealment. Certain areas of the house felt deliberately closed off, emotionally if not physically. There were no explicit public narratives laid out for visitors to consume. No framed explanations. No attempt to guide interpretation. The house did not clarify. It guarded. This restraint spoke volumes. It reflected a lifetime spent managing boundaries, deciding what could be shared and what had to remain hidden. For much of his life, Freddie Mercury navigated fame during a period when openness came with serious consequences. His identity, his relationships, and his vulnerabilities existed in a world that was not yet ready to accept them without judgment. Garden Lodge became his shield. Within its walls, he could be fully himself, free from the demands of audiences, headlines, and expectation. Outside, he transformed into the commanding figure the world demanded. This dual existence left its mark everywhere. Visitors sensed it in the careful separation between public memorabilia and private belongings. Awards and recognitions were present, but they did not dominate the space. Instead, they were almost secondary, quietly coexisting with deeply personal items. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Fame mattered, but it was not the center of his emotional universe. Perhaps the most moving realization was how much of his emotional life had been intentionally protected from public consumption. In an age where celebrities are often defined by oversharing, Mercury's restraint now feels almost radical. Garden Lodge demonstrated a conscious decision to keep something sacred, to draw a line the world was not allowed to cross, no matter how much it adored him. This decision, however, came at a cost. The silence preserved inside the house was not only peaceful, it was also heavy. It carried the weight of unspoken fears, unshared struggles, and relationships that had to exist partly in the shadows. The house did not dramatize this pain, but it did not hide it either. It simply allowed it to exist quietly in every carefully arranged room. For many who walked through Garden Lodge, this was the most transformative moment of the experience. The realization that Freddie Mercury's greatest performance may not have been on stage, but in maintaining control over what the world was allowed to see. That the confidence, humor, and power displayed publicly were, in part, armor. Necessary, effective, but exhausting. In this light, Garden Lodge became more than a personal residence. It became a symbol of survival, a testament to the ways individuals protect their inner lives when external pressures become overwhelming. It reframed Freddie Mercury not as a man consumed by excess, but as one who carefully managed his emotional resources, guarding what mattered most with quiet determination. By the time visitors reached the final rooms, it was clear that the shock of Garden Lodge was not rooted in scandal or revelation. It came from recognition. Recognition that behind one of the loudest voices in music history lived a man who valued silence, who loved deeply, who chose privacy over confession, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some truths are only safe when kept behind closed doors. By the time the narrative reaches the later rooms of Garden Lodge, the atmosphere changes again. The sense of warmth and intimacy remains, but it is now accompanied by an unmistakable gravity. This was the space where time narrowed, where life became quieter, and where the weight of awareness settled in. Nothing in these rooms announces tragedy, yet everything seems to acknowledge it. The house does not explain what happened in the final years of Freddie Mercury, but it bears the imprint of a man who knew his time was finite and chose to face that knowledge on his own terms. In these later years, Freddie Mercury withdrew further from public life, not out of bitterness or defeat, but out of intention. Garden Lodge became less a refuge from fame and more a center of control. Here, he decided how his days unfolded, who entered his world, and how much of himself he was willing to expend. Visitors later sensed this shift through subtle cues. The arrangement of rooms suggested routine. Objects remained in fixed positions, as though stability itself had become essential. There was a discipline to the environment, a careful management of energy. What is striking is how little evidence there is of fear. The popular imagination often associates terminal awareness with panic or despair. Garden Lodge told a different story. It suggested resolve, acceptance, perhaps not peaceful, but deliberate. Mercury continued to create, to plan, to surround himself with beauty. The house did not freeze in anticipation of loss. It continued to live quietly alongside him. Yet the silence grew heavier. Unlike earlier periods of his life, there were fewer outward expressions of excess, fewer signs of social spectacle. The house felt more inward-facing, as if the world beyond its walls had slowly receded in importance. This was not isolation imposed by weakness. It was isolation chosen as a form of dignity. In a time when illness could easily become public narrative, Mercury kept control by keeping distance. Those who later walked through these rooms often remarked on what was missing as much as on what remained. There were no dramatic final messages left behind, no symbolic gestures crafted for legacy, no attempt to shape how history would remember him from within these walls. This absence was perhaps the most powerful statement of all. It revealed a man uninterested in theatrical goodbyes, unwilling to turn his private struggle into a final performance. Instead, the house carried the marks of continuity. Books left open, music-related materials still present, not arranged as relics, but as tools. Art remained central. Beauty was not abandoned in the face of mortality. This continuity challenged the assumption that the end of life necessarily demands a rupture. For Mercury, it appeared to be an extension, a narrowing of focus rather than a collapse. Emotionally, Garden Lodge during these years functioned as a buffer between the public myth and the private truth. Outside, speculation grew. Rumors circulated. The world sensed change but was denied clarity. Inside, there was no need for explanation. The house absorbed the uncertainty, allowing Mercury to exist without constant negotiation of identity or narrative. It was here that he could be neither symbol nor spokesperson, only himself. The shock for the public, when confronted with this reality years later, lay in the maturity of that choice. Freddie Mercury had spent much of his life defying expectations, but in his final years, he exercised a quieter kind of rebellion. He refused spectacle. He refused exposure. He refused to let his final chapter be consumed as entertainment. Garden Lodge was the physical manifestation of that refusal. This perspective forces a reevaluation of what courage looks like. Not the courage of performance, which Mercury had mastered long ago, but the courage of restraint. The courage to withdraw without apology, to live fully within a smaller circle, to protect one's inner life when the outer world demands access. Standing in those rooms, visitors often reported a strange sense of respect, almost reverence. Not because the space felt sacred in a religious sense, but because it felt honored. The house had kept its promise. It had not betrayed him. It had not revealed more than he intended. Even when open to the world, Garden Lodge did not speak loudly. It allowed observation, not intrusion. In this way, the house became a final collaborator in Freddie Mercury's life. It supported his need for control when his body no longer offered certainty. It preserved his humanity when myth threatened to overwhelm it. It stood as a reminder that legacy is not only built on what is shown, but also on what is carefully withheld. By the end of the visit, it becomes clear that the most profound revelation is not about death, but about choice. Freddie Mercury chose how he lived his final years. He chose privacy over narrative, silence over explanation, and beauty over despair. Garden Lodge does not tell us everything about those years, and that is precisely the point. It tells us only what he was willing to share, even in absence. The world expected closure when those doors opened. What it received instead was something more unsettling and more human. The realization that even legends are entitled to boundaries, and that some truths remain powerful precisely because they were never meant to be fully revealed. When the public conversation finally shifted from shock to reflection, it became clear that the opening of Freddie Mercury's London home had done something rare. It did not merely satisfy curiosity. It recalibrated understanding. Garden Lodge did not dismantle the legend, nor did it elevate it through spectacle. Instead, It reframed what legacy means when stripped of amplification and applause. What the house revealed was not a conclusion, but a reckoning. For decades, Freddie Mercury had been frozen in cultural memory as an image. The voice, the posture, the command, the defiance. Even after his death, narratives tended to orbit around performance and excess, around the mythology of the rock star who lived faster and louder than the rest. Garden Lodge disrupted that orbit. It pulled the conversation inward, toward process rather than persona, toward endurance rather than eruption. What lingered with visitors was not a single object or room, but a feeling, a sense that the house had preserved something the public had never been allowed to claim. Not secrets in the tabloid sense, but emotional truth. The truth that brilliance does not negate vulnerability. That strength can coexist with fragility without contradiction. That the ability to dominate a stage does not erase the human need for safety, quiet, and control. This shift had profound implications for how Mercury's life and work were reassessed. His music, once heard primarily as celebration and provocation, began to sound different through the lens of the house. Lyrics that seemed triumphant took on undertones of longing. Songs that appeared fearless revealed hints of negotiation, compromise, and guarded hope. Garden Lodge did not reinterpret the music directly, but it altered the listener. And in doing so, it altered the meaning. There was also a broader cultural impact. In an era increasingly defined by access, exposure, and relentless transparency, the house stood as a counterexample. It suggested that privacy is not a flaw to be corrected, but a right to be defended. Freddie Mercury's deliberate separation between his public and private selves now reads less like evasion and more like wisdom. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that total exposure erodes autonomy, and that some parts of a life must remain unconsumed in order to survive. Critically, Garden Lodge resisted the temptation to become a shrine. It did not demand reverence through grandeur. It did not stage emotion. It allowed visitors to arrive at their own conclusions, to feel without instruction. This restraint mirrored Mercury's own approach in his final years. He did not curate his suffering for history. He did not script his ending. He trusted that what mattered would endure without explanation. That trust has proven justified. The house changed the conversation not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed enough. Enough to humanize without diminishing. Enough to deepen admiration without replacing it with pity. Enough to remind the world that legacy is not only the sum of achievements, but the integrity with which a life is lived when no one is watching. In this sense, Garden Lodge became an ethical artifact. It posed questions rather than delivering answers. What do we owe the public, and what do we owe ourselves? Where does admiration end and entitlement begin? How much of a person's inner life should be accessible simply because they are loved by many? Freddie Mercury's home did not lecture on these issues. It embodied them. Perhaps the most enduring effect of the house is how it complicates the idea of greatness. It challenges the assumption that to matter, one must always be visible. Mercury's final years, lived largely away from the public eye, were not a retreat from significance. They were a different expression of it. A demonstration that choosing dignity over display can itself be a form of strength. As time passes, the shock that once surrounded the opening of Garden Lodge has softened into something more lasting. Respect. Not the distant respect reserved for untouchable icons, but the quieter respect given to individuals who navigated impossible pressures with intention. Freddie Mercury emerges from this narrative not as a contradiction, but as a continuum. The performer and the private man were not opposites. They were complementary strategies for survival in a world that demanded too much. In the end, what they found inside Freddie Mercury's London home did not change who he was. It changed how he is understood. The house did not expose weakness. It revealed balance. It showed that behind the thunder of stadiums lived a man who valued stillness. Behind the confidence lived careful self-protection. And behind the legend lived a human being who chose his boundaries with precision. Garden Lodge stands now as a quiet testament to that choice. It reminds us that the most powerful legacies are not always built in public view. Some are constructed patiently, privately, and with unwavering clarity about what deserves to be shared and what must remain sacred. In the years since the doors of Garden Lodge were opened, the cultural position of Freddie Mercury has subtly but permanently shifted. He has not been reduced, corrected, or revised. Instead, he's been expanded. The revelation of his private world did not weaken the legend. It complicated it, and in doing so, made it more durable. What emerged was a form of immortality no longer rooted only in spectacle, but in resonance. For a long time, Freddie Mercury occupied a specific place in popular memory. He was the embodiment of excess, confidence, and defiance. He represented a kind of fearless self-expression that seemed untouched by doubt. This image served an important purpose. It inspired. It liberated. It gave people permission to be louder, bolder, and less apologetic. But it was also incomplete. Garden Lodge filled in the missing dimension, not by contradicting that image, but by grounding it. Modern audiences, especially those shaped by conversations about mental health, identity, and personal boundaries, now hear Mercury differently. The power of his performances remains undeniable, but it is now accompanied by an awareness of the internal labor required to sustain that power. His confidence is no longer seen as effortless. It is understood as constructed, maintained, and fiercely protected. This understanding does not diminish admiration. It intensifies it. The house also reframed the way silence is interpreted in celebrity narratives. In contemporary culture, silence is often treated as absence or avoidance. Garden Lodge suggested something else. Silence as intention. Silence as agency. Freddie Mercury's refusal to narrate every aspect of his life now appears less like secrecy and more like self-authorship. He chose what the world could know, and he accepted the consequences of that choice. This perspective has influenced how newer generations relate to his story. They no longer approach it solely as a tale of triumph and tragedy, but as a study in self-preservation. Mercury's life demonstrates that visibility is not the same as authenticity, and that being seen by millions does not guarantee being understood. His legacy now offers a language for discussing the costs of performance in all its forms: artistic, emotional, and social. There is also a deeper cultural shift at play. Freddie Mercury's private life existed in a historical context that offered limited safety for openness. Garden Lodge, viewed through a modern lens, highlights the emotional discipline required to survive in such an environment. It reveals not just a personal struggle, but a structural one. His choices were shaped by the world he inhabited, and the house stands as evidence of how individuals adapt when acceptance is conditional. As a result, Freddie Mercury has become more than a symbol of musical excellence. He has become a reference point in discussions about boundaries, identity, and the right to opacity. In an age that increasingly demands explanation and confession, his life offers a counter-narrative. It suggests that withholding can be as meaningful as revealing, and that dignity sometimes requires restraint. Importantly, this evolution in understanding has not shifted focus away from music. On the contrary, it has brought listeners closer to it. Songs once celebrated purely for their energy are now heard as layered expressions of longing, control, and emotional negotiation. The music gains depth because the man behind it is no longer flattened into a caricature of confidence. What Garden Lodge ultimately provided was context, not answers, not closure, but a frame through which Freddie Mercury's life can be viewed with greater nuance. It allowed the public to recognize that greatness is not defined by constant exposure, and that survival, especially under relentless scrutiny, is an achievement in itself. In this way, Freddie Mercury's immortality now rests on more than memory or myth. It rests on relevance. His story continues to speak because it mirrors enduring human tensions between visibility and privacy, expression and protection, love and self-defense. Garden Lodge did not end the conversation about who he was. It ensured that the conversation would mature. As time moves forward, the shock that once surrounded the opening of his home has transformed into something quieter and more lasting. Understanding. And in that understanding, Freddie Mercury's voice continues to echo, not only through speakers and stadiums, but through the shared recognition that even the brightest figures deserve spaces where they are allowed to be unseen. When the story of Garden Lodge finally settles, what remains is not shock, nor revelation, nor even closure. What remains is a recalibrated way of seeing. The opening of Garden Lodge did not deliver a final chapter to the life of Freddie Mercury. Instead, it asked the world to slow down, to look again, and to reconsider what it truly means to know someone we call an icon. For years, the public believed familiarity was created through visibility. The more a figure was seen, discussed, and celebrated, the more complete the understanding seemed. Garden Lodge quietly dismantled that illusion. It revealed that proximity does not equal intimacy, and that the most essential truths about a person may exist far beyond the reach of cameras and applause. What the house left behind was not a list of answers, but a feeling of responsibility. Responsibility to approach legacy with humility, to recognize that admiration does not grant ownership, to understand that even those who give the world their voice, their talent, and their presence are entitled to inner territories that remain untouched. Freddie Mercury did not owe the world every version of himself, and Garden Lodge stands as proof that he knew where to draw the line. This realization changes the relationship between audience and artist. It invites a quieter form of appreciation, one rooted not in consumption, but in respect. The house did not demand that visitors feel sorrow or awe. It allowed them to feel recognition. Recognition that greatness is often sustained by invisible effort, that strength is frequently built in silence, that survival can be an act of intention rather than endurance alone. In the end, Garden Lodge became more than a preserved residence. It became a mirror. It reflected back the assumptions the world had made about Freddie Mercury and gently asked whether those assumptions were ever fair. It suggested that legends are not diminished by privacy, but protected by it. That mystery is not a failure of storytelling, but sometimes its highest form. Freddie Mercury's voice will continue to fill rooms, arenas, and memories. But Garden Lodge ensures that his silence is also heard, not as absence, but as presence, not as secrecy, but as self-respect. And in that balance between what he shared and what he withheld, his story finds its most enduring power. The doors may now be open, but the lesson remains clear. Some lives are not meant to be fully explained. They are meant to be honored.